I do sometimes think, actually, when I'm writing, I have that lovely thing of the world just disappears when I'm writing. It's a gorgeous feeling for everything else to melt away. And I guess probably that is one of the reasons I write the sort of things I do, because actually the world is a really, really grim place at the moment. The real world really does melt away when I'm in the middle of writing.
I am very happy to have the chance to speak with you, Carole. I will start by asking, when did you first start writing?
I started writing when I was really very young. I had a typewriter of my mum's, like an old-fashioned typewriter, and I would sit and type away at it. And I was a fan of, there was, I think, some sort of crime writer called Ellery Queen or something on TV, like a TV series. And I got really inspired by that. And I'd write these sort of stories, and I'd actually bind the pages together so that I had a book. So I think from quite an early age, I wanted to write. And then for up until my 30s, I knew I could write, but I didn't know what to write. And I could never think of a story. And I think it was because I was always trying to come up with a literary fiction idea. I thought if I were to write, it had to be literary fiction. And I don't know why I thought that. And then one day I just realized, well, that's just ridiculous. Just write what you know. And so I was on my way to a hotel, and I sat down for 2 hours, and I'd mapped out a novel I could write. And so, yeah, I was in my, I think, I want to say my mid-30s at that point, maybe late 30s.
And what was that novel?
It's called The Broken Heart Repair Plan, and it's contemporary fiction. And it's about a young woman who jacks in her job because she's bored and heartbroken, and goes to work as a tour leader in the Middle East, in Jordan. And so I drew very heavily on things that had happened to me in my life. So I did go out to the Middle East for a short while and work as a tour leader. And I did get dumped at Heathrow Airport in the way that the protagonist in the novel does. And I got inspiration from other things that have happened in my life, but only inspiration. The novel it's not a memoir. It is very much a novel. And actually, it's quite funny because some things that happen in it, I've got one friend who always says, oh, yeah, he did that. And that. And I went, no. That happens to the character in my novel. It's just that he is quite close as a character to somebody I dated in real life. So I did that quite typical first novel thing where you draw very heavily on things that have happened to you. The scene that I open the novel with, which is the protagonist getting dumped at Heathrow, when that happened to me in real life, I was very much still grieving for my mother, who died a few years before. And so my reaction, even though he wasn't the love of my life, my reaction involved a lot of tears and probably a lot more upset than I would have had that not happened. And I did mirror that in the novel. And it's very interesting because a friend of mine narrated it for me, because I have a family member who doesn't see very well, so she can't read. So an actor friend of mine narrated it for me. And it was only when I listened to the narration that I realized that the protagonist cries a bit too much for the circumstances. And it's just because I did mimic too closely how it had transpired in real life, because actually, without the grief element, somebody wouldn't have been quite as devastated as she was. So it's quite interesting that, I suppose because it was the first time I'd ever written a novel, I hadn't quite appreciated how you do have to distance yourself a bit more, even if you're using something that happened. Because it is a great way to start a novel. It's a very dramatic dumping at an airport. It's but I mirrored it a bit too closely in the reactions.
It must be so interesting for you to look back on that and see that.
Yeah, really, really interesting. But, apart from that, it was very interesting when I listened to the narration, because actually, apart from that, I genuinely feel proud of that novel. I didn't try to seek a publishing deal or anything like that. I just see it as my training novel. I put it out there in the world. I mean, this is, oh my goodness, coming up for 10 years ago now. So I just published it myself as an ebook, and that was enough for me. I didn't have a desire to, try and get it published, because I knew that it wasn't going to be the thing that I would get published, and I was totally at peace with that. And now I've completely lost track of why I was making that point.
That's perfect. So, but it does lead me to ask you, so having gotten that novel done and behind you, what are your next steps?
Yeah, so I then wanted to write something very different. And I'd been on a writing course when I was writing that particular novel. And one day we'd just been doing character sketches, and I came up with this gorgeous character who I really, really loved, a youngish man. And I wanted to write a novel about him. And I really wanted to have a go at writing a novel where I didn't plan it all out in advance. So with the first novel, I had a really robust plan, and I found that gave me huge freedom to write, because if I knew where I was going each chapter, it allowed me just to focus on the creativity. And I thought, no, I want to try something different. I just want to start writing and see where it leads. And I realized that is not a very good approach for me. I ground to a halt. I would write little scenes every now and again, but I really struggled to come up with a convincing plot for this wonderful character. And so I had a very fallow period for quite a few years. And then in October of 2021, I literally woke from a dream at about 3:00 in the morning. I had dreamt an entire opening sequence for a novel. I could not believe it. It's never happened to me before. It's not happened to me since, but it was absolutely brilliant. And the woman in the dream was older. She was about 10 years older than me. And it sparked off an idea for what I could do with that, which do I want to do plot spoilers? So it's another contemporary fiction, but it's about two friends who are in their 60s who realize they don't want to wait for retirement before they make dramatic changes in their lives. So it's really exploring what life can be like in your 60s, because I get very, very frustrated with a lot of novels that have older women, and they're quite often two-dimensional, and they are quite often portrayed as very old, very fusty, very out of date, harking back to a former time. And I've got friends now, because I'm in my mid-50s, I've got friends in their early 60s, and it really does aggravate me. And I think with brilliant things like Grace and Frankie coming to our screens a few years ago, I think there is just an appetite for older women in fiction. And so, so that's my aim. But what I find really interesting is I really want it to be quite a light-hearted, funny novel. But actually, in reality, what I'm drawn to every time I sit down and write is human drama and the emotional drama that goes on with people. So I don't think I've got quite enough light humor in there yet. So I think what's going to happen with this one is I'm going to have to write the whole thing and then go back and say, okay, what do I chop so that I can get to the more light-hearted bits a bit more quickly?
So I'm curious, if you're naturally drawn to writing the more dramatic parts, why do you feel that it has to be a light-hearted?
It doesn't have to be. I just have a real desire to write something that's funny. Quite a key part of where I've come up with this idea is my closest friend and I, for many, many years, we've had this sort of ongoing joke that when we're little old ladies, we'll own this rather magical building, which on the ground floor will have a stationery shop, because my best friend is obsessed with beautiful stationery. So it all stemmed from us being in a stationery shop in America and just going, wow, isn't stationery amazing? And we'd always sort of built up this story that on the level above the shop, we'd each have a living space, but we'd have a communal kitchen. And then the floor on top of that would be able to house a carer or two for when we're really, really, really old. So we had this story and it kept getting embroidered. So when I had this dream, which was a very dramatic opening sequence for a novel, and I realized that the woman in my dream was older, I thought, well, she's not as old as Heather and I had imagined ourselves being with our magical little stationery shop, but she is older than me. And so I thought, oh, I could use the stationery shop as the idea for this novel. And actually, whenever we tell that story to each other, it is quite funny. It's like, I have to have the rescue dog. She has the rescue donkey, but then we have to have two because the donkey would get lonely and we'd be in this little village and there'd be all sorts of eccentric characters like you find in light-hearted novels. So that's where the light-hearted idea had come from. But because it's me, I started out with this quite dramatic opening sequence, and then one of the characters has a really, really strong dilemma at work, and in the end she resigns. And the other is realizing that she's getting bored in her relationship. And so it does become about, people's emotional dramas. And I haven't quite got to the light-hearted stationery shop bit yet. But I've just realised, if I talk about this on a podcast, will somebody steal my idea and write it before me?
Not as well as you will.
Oh, no.
I know. I don't think they could write it as well as, but it sounds like it comes from a place of something that's very meaningful to you. And I don't think somebody else could do that.
Quite eccentric. You're right. I think I'm on fairly safe territory, aren't I, Sarah?
I think you're good. I think you're good to go. But I'm looking forward to reading it. So what's your timeline? Not to put any pressure on you. But...
Very good question. So I'm about 30,000 words in, chapter 6. So I managed to map out about 2/3 of it. But what's quite exciting for me is I haven't identified what that final dramatic sort of ending, not the ending, because I'll have resolution of some sort, but that final dramatic event is going to be. I've got some minor dramas on the way. So at the moment, I'm in quite an intense phase of writing. I've got some time off at the moment. So I'm aiming to write for an average of 3 hours a day for the whole of March. So we'll see where I get to, because I think I can probably write about 40,000 words this month. Because it's contemporary fiction rather than literary. So I'm not having to think about where every single word, fits precisely. You can write with quite a flow, I think, with contemporary fiction. So I would like to think that by the middle of the year, I'll have a first draft and I can spend the second half of the year doing massive editing, because whole chunks are going to need taking out on this one, because they're older women. So I've got a lot of backstory in at the moment. And nobody wants a whole heap of backstory because it slows a novel down. I mean, you want some because they're women of experience and experience has shaped their lives. But ultimately, this isn't a story about their whole lives. This is a story about this part of their life. So I will really need to think hard when I edit about how much of that backstory stays in and how much gets cut to keep the plot moving forward.
So I have to ask you, because I don't know, when you say contemporary fiction versus literary fiction, I don't know what that means.
No, I suppose it's a bit of probably a distinction I have in my head. So it's not the sort of novel that would ever be nominated for a Booker or the Women's Prize for Fiction. It's a lighter read, I suppose, than something literary. So I would think of literary fiction as being something. I'd think of, Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet would be a work of literary fiction, or, pretty much everything that Rose Tremaine writes, I would think of literary. Whereas I would think of Marian Keyes as being contemporary fiction, that there's not that there's not that much emphasis on the beauty of the writing. Whereas I think something that is much more about the language or symbolism or that's, I suppose, more serious. I suppose I think of literary fiction. There is definitely a distinction, because if you go into a bookshop, or not so much in a bookshop, but if you go onto something like an Amazon, things will be categorized in that way.
Interesting. Okay. I'm looking over at my bookshelves.
Yeah.
Just trying to think like what is more the literary fiction and what could be more the contemporary.
So it's interesting, because I would think of Barbara Kingsolver's more recent work as being literary, but I would probably think of her earlier work about Mexican and Guatemalan people settling in the States actually as being more contemporary fiction. They were lighter in a way. I don't know. It'd be actually. Do you know what? That would be a great subject for a panel podcast, wouldn't it? What is literary fiction? What is contemporary fiction. Because for me, I think it's a difference between almost the attitude towards language, because I think of contemporary fiction being the language is just there to tell the story, whereas in literary fiction, the language has much more of a role of its own in its own right, so that you might read a passage and go, oh, I just have to stop and read that again because that's so beautiful. Whereas in contemporary fiction, you just, you're caught up in the story of it and the characters.
Interesting, because I think that when you first said that, I thought you meant more what you're talking about. So the subjects are more literary. I hadn't thought about it as far as the kind of language that you would use.
It would be very interesting to know how other people would distinguish. They might say popular fiction rather than contemporary, I guess. That might be the way a lot of people would distinguish. But I suppose I just say contemporary because it's very definitely not historical. It's fascinating, actually. Now you ask me.
I'm really curious.
Why I'm making a distinction.
Is it the kind of book you take on a plane? Like, is that, you read that on a plane?
Yeah. But then a lot of people will read literary fiction when they go on holiday. So I don't know. Well, let's ask 10 writers and see what they say about that. Let's put it this way. I wouldn't be aiming for the Booker Prize with this.
Let's see what happens.
I mean, even if I aimed for a publisher, that would be something, but I'm probably not even going to do that. Because for me, actually, do you know what? It's just about the writing. I don't have this burning need to be famous, published, right? I mean, yes, how lovely that would be in some parallel universe, but actually for me it is about the pure creative process. I don't have this burning need to prove that I am somehow a real writer by getting published. I'm quite happy being a real writer purely because I am writing. So if it's only ever my friends and relatives and their contacts who read what I put out, that's fine.
I find that interesting because there is a part of me that yearns for some validation, external validation. And so, the fact that you are writing and you're comfortable to put your own books out, and whoever finds your book and reads it outside of maybe your circle, yeah, I struggle with that a bit. I do struggle with that because I would want some publisher to, but I don't think they do that anymore. Like to put your book out there and like they fight for your book. Nobody's going to fight for your book.
No, and I think that's probably why I made my peace with that idea a long time ago now, that actually that whole process of trying to get an agent, trying to get a publisher, and then, then you read the stories of the people who are successful and it's all rosy. I just think, do I really want to put myself through that? I'm not sure I do. I mean, yes, obviously in my wildest dreams, I would be a wildly popular novelist actually making money from writing. I'm not going to, sit here and disingenuously pretend that isn't a dream. But I suppose what I mean is, in reality, actually, I'm not chasing after that at all. I'm just not. When I finish it, if somebody says, go on, I'll help you write a synopsis, send it to this agent and that agent, then yes, I'll have a go. But it won't be in that this has got to happen, otherwise I am going to be crushed way. It will be, if it happens, that's quite nice.
I think I'm just going to circle back to something that I was wondering about earlier. As a woman, you can write stories from a woman's perspective. And so the woman is your main character. And then you mentioned that in this other novel, like a young man is your main character. And I know I sometimes have this reaction to men writing about women. And so now you're a woman writing from a man's perspective. So what does that mean to you?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I struggled to bring that novel into fruition, if I'm honest. I think I found it incredibly difficult. And I really hear you when you say you quite often have a problem if a man is writing a woman as his central character, because I think there is, fundamentally that problem that we have a very distinct lens, and it is hard to make that anything else. And I have similar questions about other identities that I would like to include in novels. And I don't have a problem putting men in as secondary characters, but I would say I don't think I write them particularly well, if I'm honest. I do find it quite hard to get right inside their heads. But the current novel I'm working on, I have plans for sort of quite a diverse mix of people. And I do regularly ask myself questions about, is that okay to do? How will I do it so that they're not representing an intersectionality? Because I really don't want that to be the function of that person in a novel. I want them there because life is full of really lovely, diverse people. And so I would like my novel not just to be about white women, white cis women, but how do I do that so that, people who have identities that I don't share, I don't want them having to represent, because I think that's a very, cis white privileged thing to do. So it's a real, I find it a really interesting question when it comes to writing fiction. When it comes to those characters, I will ask people I know who share aspects of those identities and say, do you feel comfortable with this? Because if they do, then I've got a bit more confidence, and then I will think about who else I would just need to check in with. I heard on the radio the other day, I haven't read it yet, or I don't know whether it's even out, but Irving Welsh has written a novel, and he's got 3 trans characters in there. And I can't remember the context in which he was talking about it on the radio, but he was saying he actually had there was somebody called a sensitivity reader, because these 3 characters were they had very important and distinctive roles in his novel. And he said, obviously I just don't want to get it wrong, because I can ask my friends or people I know, but that's not the same as somebody taking, an objective look. And I was really interested to hear him say that, actually. And I thought it was great to hear. But yes, back to your original question, I think the writing from a man's perspective is probably why I struggled to write that second novel and had to just put it to one side, no matter how much I loved this character. I loved him. So the thing about that is he's a quite an extreme introvert. And so so the central question was, how does somebody who is that much of an introvert actually make their mark in the world, actually make an impact in the world, when they're constantly overlooked and constantly almost dismissed because they are particularly in a workspace, not able to make their contribution heard in the same way that the extroverts do.
So, I mean, I guess I would just ask, like, why is he a male? Like, why wasn't he a female?
Because I was doing a writing course. Well, it was actually a yoga course, but there was a novelist there. And so she did novel writing techniques in the afternoon, and we were writing character sketches, and he just popped onto the page. And I read this bit out about him, and we all went, oh my God, isn't he a lovely character? So that's why. That's why.
Okay.
I really love him. He's a really, really, really lovely character. So at some point, maybe I'll write a short story with him instead.
And I don't want to say, like, you don't have to not write about a male. I just find it interesting to think about what it is to write from, and you're right, because you opened that door too.
Yeah.
Can I write about somebody who is trans, or can I write about somebody who is not white, or can I write about, because the world is such a diverse place.
Absolutely. And I think the conclusion I've come to for myself, because I struggle to write about Tom, this character, is I am very comfortable writing other identities, but not as my key protagonist, because I think because I write very much in the close third person, so it's written in the third person, but you're really seeing things from their perspective. And I genuinely don't feel I've got the right to do that about somebody who has a very different identity to me. I don't feel that that's my story to tell. And that's just a very personal conclusion I've come to, but I'm very, very happy to have a very diverse set of people in my novels. I want that because I experience the world as a very diverse place, and I'm at my most comfortable feeling that the world is a diverse place, and I want that reflected in what I write now. But I probably wouldn't do that from the perspective of having somebody of a different identity to me as the key protagonist. To be honest, I actually feel at the moment I've got plenty to say about being a middle-aged, heading for later-aged woman. I mean, there is enough to say about that. There's plenty to unfold. It's not well represented in literature in positive, having real agency over your life kind of way. I
Absolutely.
tend to find that older women in literature tend to be more, things happen to them. They are put upon, or they react to situations rather than being the agents of their own destiny. And I think there's not an awful lot talked about sex, about women who are older. So again, and my novel wasn't influenced by them at all, but I take great inspiration from Grace and Frankie. I mean, look at them. I mean, look at the actors, look at Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda. I mean, how bloody marvelous are they? But you look at the characters and you've got these two women, very different backgrounds, very different outlooks, but they're in their 80s and they're making a sex toy and a toilet. I mean, if you can't take inspiration from that as an older woman, there is no inspiration in the world. But there isn't enough of that. The fact that they're still a huge exception, and yet you look at how many of us there are in the world who have a huge appetite for TV, cinema, novels. We are huge consumers of those media. Let's make sure there's more of us in them. Women who are older aren't necessarily always divorcees whose children have flown the nest, and therefore struggling to find a role. There are lots of different types of older women. Rock on the older women, that's what I say.
Right on. Then
right on.
Keep
exactly.
writing.
Not rock on, right on.
Exactly. I love that. So I don't know if it's a kind of a natural segue, but I'm just going to ask you about vulnerability as far as, what you might write about or the things that you read and why that might be meaningful to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think my favorite reads are always books that have a big element of, emotional landscape that individuals feel. So rather than big epic plot-driven novels, I'm much more about the interior emotional landscape. And so I suppose that's why I'm drawn to writing about that as well. And I mean, in terms of vulnerability, that first novel I wrote drew an awful lot on things that had happened to me. So heartbreak and grief play major, major roles. And so I think I didn't really worry about it too much, but I think there was huge vulnerability there in that people would read it and know that I'd been through those things and therefore think, oh, this is exactly how it happened. So there's a vulnerability there. But I think in a way, using my vulnerability to write something interesting and that people can resonate with and therefore relate to and take comfort from in a way, I think is quite important to me. I suppose I've never really thought about it quite as consciously as that, but I think that probably, is quite a driver. That I think there's nothing more interesting than the intricacies of human emotions and psychology and drama. There's just endless fascination there in terms of how we react to each other, how we relate. And so I suppose there probably is quite a lot of vulnerability I bring to that, but it obviously in a very different way to say somebody who's writing memoir. I do not know how people write memoir. I do not know how they do it, because I don't think I could ever be that vulnerable. But it was interesting because in this current novel I'm writing, I had a sex scene, and I thought, if I write that, will people think that that's the way I approach it? And I sat there thinking, gosh, they will. That's quite interesting. Do I want to change that? Because people will think that's my view on sex, and it happens not to be. But that made me feel very vulnerable, actually. Made me feel really vulnerable that people will think either it's sexual experience that has happened to me, or that's my approach and attitude to sex. And it'll be interesting to see whether the sex makes it into the novel, actually, because it may not stay in, because that makes me feel quite vulnerable that people will think that's about my personal sexuality. Very interesting, that one. I don't have the same fear of what people will think if I'm writing about somebody, I don't know, going through heartbreak or even grief, which you could argue are, similarly really painful personal experiences. But I guess people talk about those more than they would ever talk about sex. Very interesting to see what ends up in there. Whether it's saucy or not. I might get all prudish and take out the sex scenes.
But that's what you said about your first novel. So the reaction that you had being dumped at Heathrow Airport was emotions that had nothing to do actually with that person. It was about your mother. So I guess it's just, how much do you reveal also about yourself through that? People can also see, oh, actually, she's not just reacting to that moment. She's reacting to other things. Yeah. And in this novel too, maybe.
Yeah. And a lot of the things I don't mind. But like I say, if you're writing in something that is quite hot and sexy, but it isn't at all like you are. I don't know,
Carole. Is it you?
Very interesting. Well, like I say, I find that particularly interesting. Like, why am I more sensitive about people maybe reading too much into sex scenes than I am about writing scenes about heartbreak and grief? It's an amazing thing to feel more sensitive about.
Yeah, because my head went straight to that scene at Heathrow. But maybe that's just I'm sharing too much about myself. I'm way more sensitive to that.
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting that the things that you do mind about or worry about. So the other thing that was interesting about my first novel, once I'd written it, I thought, this is nothing like my dad and it's not based on my dad. But because of what's happening in the novel, I suddenly got really worried that my dad would read it and go, but I'm not like that. I didn't do that. And so I spent a significant amount of time rewriting the father in this novel so that he wasn't like, I put him as far away from my father as I could. Do you know what happened? When I published it and said, right, well, here's the book, Dad and his wife were saying they were reading it. And so I said, oh, how are you getting on with the novel, Dad? Oh, no, it didn't have a murder on the first page. So I realized it wasn't my sort of thing. So I didn't bother reading it. So he never read this character that I had fretted over, who wasn't him, wasn't based on him. But then I set about changing even more because I was worried that Dad might think it was based on him, and he didn't even end up reading it. So I'm not going to worry about whether my dad reads my next novel or not. Dad, if you're listening to this podcast.
I would worry. Not worry, but I would be conscious of that people that are, you talked about that before too, like friends of yours or family feel that they're represented in the work that you do. And you might feel like you're exposing them in some way.
And it's interesting because I've had a couple of people say, oh, is that based on that or that? And it's not. It's you spend your whole life absorbing little details. And so there may be one lovely little quirk that a friend has that you use in a character, but it doesn't mean the whole character is based on them. It's just that you quite like the fact that somebody flicks their hair out of their eyes in a particular way, or that they, I don't know, that they swear in a particular way or use sarcasm in a particular way. And little details will make its way into characters, but the characters are not at all based on those people. But it is interesting because we're like little magpies. We're always going around and stealing little bits from here and there. I was out with a friend a couple of weeks ago and I can't even remember the full context of the conversation, but she went, fish and jazz. I'm quite new to both of those. And I just said, I've got to write that down because at some point somewhere in a short story or in a book, I have to use that line, fish and jazz. I'm quite new to both. I mean, what a brilliant line. And it's all about stealing, isn't it? Just spying those little gems that you pick up and run off with and use somewhere 5 years later.
I think that's what makes it real to the readers.
Yes.
That they can read something like that and they feel like, oh, I either have a friend like that or I don't, but that's funny. Like I can imagine somebody saying that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's those funny little and funny little things that happen. So I was in a supermarket queue the other day with my friend, and the woman behind us came up to the till, and she'd obviously not been in there for a while. And she said to the chap behind the till, "Oh, there's no screens anymore. I could touch you." And then she realized what she'd said. And we all laughed because we all related to that. It's the sort of thing we would say out loud and then go, "Oh my goodness, I've just said that out loud. I really shouldn't have done." And it was brilliant because everybody around her was having a jolly good old chuckle, and she was joining in with it. But it is those sorts of things, isn't it? You just pick them up and use them at some point. It's things I care about very much in the real world. I don't necessarily want to write about. If anything, I kind of want my writing just to help people get away from all of that without tipping into fantasy. I want people just to be able to laugh and cry and follow the drama of human hearts. I occasionally give myself a hard time about that and think that I should be doing better in terms of issues that really matter, but I can't. So, for example, I think of something like Rose Tremaine's The Road Home. It's one of my favourite books. It's an exceptional book. It is absolutely incredible. I couldn't write that sort of novel, no matter how much I loved reading it. And I suppose that's where I draw that distinction with literary fiction, because it is my subject matter is like more lighthearted or more, I'm not writing on that big world scale.
Maybe not, but getting dumped at Heathrow Airport is something that every person of a certain age can relate to and feel all those feelings.
Yeah.
And, maybe it's not like the world scale and it's not war.
Everybody has experienced heartbreak unless you're 1 year old. I mean, anyone above 5 years old has experienced heartbreak. I can remember being 7 at school and having a crush on a boy, and he didn't invite me to his birthday party. That was a heartbreak. So I think we all recognize heartbreak, and it does help reading about it because you go, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
I think that's what my writing does. It entertains you, but it is about not being alone. You can recognize the stuff that's happening in there as stuff that might have happened to you.
So thank you so much for
thank you.
this.
It was lovely talking to you. Really, really nice.